Hello again, everybody. My name is Dr. Jacob Gran, and in this video we're going to learn the voice leading rules for dominant seventh chords using Thoroughbass exercises. This is going to build on the Thoroughbass exercises that we learned about in the video on consonant triads in keyboard style. So if you haven't seen that video, I recommend watching it first. These exercises are meant to be literally hands-on, so I also recommend finding a keyboard instrument to work the voice leading patterns into the muscle memory of your hands and fingers. The dominant seventh chord has 4 chord members, and each of them has a characteristic resolution to tones of the tonic triad. I've written this example with the root of the chord in the bass, but just like the triad, this chord can be inverted so that any of the chord members may serve as the bass note. We'll get to inversions later on in the video. I'll explain the rules of how these tones resolve here before moving on to the musical examples. The number one rule is that the chordal seventh pretty much always resolves down by step to the chordal third of the tonic triad. The second most predictable resolution is the chordal third, or leading tone, which will, in almost all cases, resolve up by step to the tonic. The third and seventh form a dissonant harmonic interval of either a diminished fifth, as it's spelled here, or augmented fourth, and their resolution in contrary motion to the root and third of the tonic triad is more or less obligatory. The only exception would be that the diminished fifth may sometimes move in parallel motion to the root and fifth of the tonic chord. They call these unequal fifths, and it's somewhat rare. The chordal fifth is much less predictable. It will likely move by step, either to scale degree 1, as at a cadence, but also possibly up to scale degree 3. This one isn't as strong of a tendency tone, so which way it goes will depend on the context of the other voices. Finally, the root of the chord will leap to scale degree 1, either down a fifth like it's shown here, or up a fourth. However, this one is only really necessary when the chord occurs in root position. If the dominant chord is inverted, so that the root of the chord happens somewhere other than the bass, it may also stay on scale degree 5 as a common tone, moving in oblique motion to the other voices. Notice that none of the other chord members typically resolve to scale degree 5 over the tonic chord. So this common tone is actually the only fluent way to produce a complete tonic triad in the chord of resolution. Notice also that the chordal fifth resolving to either scale degree 1 or 3 is redundant, since those scale degrees are already covered by the chordal third and seventh. For that reason, it's very common to omit the chordal fifth from the dominant chord, and to instead use that free upper part to double the root. This is the smoothest way to achieve a complete tonic triad without sacrificing the most characteristic dissonance of the dominant seventh chord. Here is a table of some of the typical resolutions of the root position dominant seventh chord in keyboard style. Root position seventh chords are always indicated with a figured bass symbol 7. Just like with the triads, we can label the positions of the right hand based on the topmost chord member. In octave position, third position, and seventh position, we can see the very typical omission of the chordal fifth and doubling of the root that I mentioned just a moment ago. The doubled roots are held as common tones, which allow us to resolve to complete tonic triads. In the fifth position chord, by definition, we cannot omit the fifth, and so we end up resolving to an incomplete tonic triad that is missing its chordal fifth, scale degree 5. There is one way to move from a fifth position dominant seventh to a complete tonic triad, and this would involve resolving the leading tone not upwards by step to scale degree 1, but instead leaping down to scale degree 5. This is called frustrating the leading tone, and we should only do it when the leading tone occurs in an inner voice, and when the bass leaps upwards in contrary motion, in order to avoid approaching the perfect fifth between scale degrees 1 and 5 by direct motion. Here is a Thoroughbass exercise by the composer Salomon Jadassohn, the bearded gentleman from the thumbnail. Jadassohn provides 3 different solutions based on the 3 possible starting hand positions of the first chord. This should look a lot like the exercises from the video on 5-3 and 6-3 triads. The only difference is that we are now incorporating the root position 7th chord and resolving it in the idiomatic ways shown in the previous table. Here is Jadassohn's realization starting in octave position. Notice that the first 7th chord is complete, and so he ends up resolving to an incomplete triad on the next downbeat. The 7th chord in the 4th measure is also complete, but he manages to provide a complete tonic triad by frustrating the leading tone in the lowest voice of the right-hand chord. The final bass figures 8 and 7 indicate that the chordal 7th should be approached as a passing tone from the octave, indicated by the green quarter notes. Here's what this realization sounds like. Here is Jadassohn's realization, starting with the right hand in 3rd position. And finally, here is Jadassohn's realization, starting with the right hand in 5th position. Here are 2 bass lines with figures that you can use to practice the voice leading of the dominant 7th chord. Jadassohn indicates the recommended hand position for the starting chord. If you're feeling ambitious, I would also recommend transposing these examples into the common major and minor keys, respectively. Now that we've gone over the standard voice leading for root position 7th chords, let's take a look at the 3 possible inversions. To avoid overcomplicating things, I'm going to keep the names for the 4 different right-hand positions, even though technically these names no longer refer to the interval above the base of the topmost voice, but to the chord member of the topmost voice. With all 3 inversions, we avoid doubling the bass, which is why there are gaps in the table. Notice that this means that we don't need to omit any chord members from the dominant 7th or the tonic triad. Inversions allow the harmony to be complete, and also allow the bass line to move with an improved melodic fluency. When the chordal third occurs in the bass, we call it a 6-5 chord, and the leading tone resolves to the tonic just like it would if it had occurred in any other voice. The chordal 5th occurring in the bass is called a 4-3 chord, and the chordal 7th in the bass is a 4-2 chord, although often the figured bass symbol is simply the number 2. Notice that unlike the others, the 4-2 chords resolve to 6-3 position triads. Here is an example of a figured bass line that includes all 3 inverted dominant 7th chords, as well as a root position 7th at the cadence. Let's listen to Jadassohn's realization, paying special attention to how the inversions allow the bass line to form a much more fluent, stepwise melody than the previous example that only used 7th chords in root position. just as before, here is one major and one minor figured bass line that you can use to practice the inversions of the dominant seventh chord. The slashes through the sixth and fourth in the figures of the second example are a shorthand way to indicate that those figures should be chromatically raised. It's the same as if we had added a sharp in front of the figure. The final category of seventh chord is the applied dominant seventh. These are dominant seventh chords borrowed from closely related keys that resolve to triads other than the tonic. In this example, we see a dominant seventh borrowed from the key of G major that resolves to the G major triad in the third measure, as if that triad was the tonic. The chord figures will include accidentals that indicate how the chordal third or seventh needs to be altered chromatically in order to form the dominant seventh quality. There are many ways to label applied sevenths, but I prefer putting the Roman numeral in parenthesis and drawing an arrow that shows the harmonic connection to whichever triad the dominant seventh resolves to. In this case, the applied seventh resolves to a G major triad, which is the 5 chord in the key of C major. Applied dominant sevenths can also occur in inversion, as shown here, and so the possibilities for the different combinations are really far too large to show in a single table. Luckily, the applied dominant seventh chords resolve in exactly the same way that we've studied so far in the video. There's only one new concept to worry about when realizing or composing applied sevenths, and this is that we must avoid chromatic cross relations. Here's an example of an applied 4/3 chord. One faulty way to realize this bass would be like this. In this realization, the top voice leaps from F to C sharp, while the voice second from the top leaps down to the note A. A cross relation occurs when there is a voice that had the diatonic version of a note, in this case the C natural, and in the subsequent chord, a different voice takes a chromatically altered version of the same note, in this case C sharp. The cross relation was considered a voice leading error, originally in the context of choral music, when it would be very difficult for a soprano to leap from that F to the C sharp, not only because it is a leap of a diminished interval, but also because the altos standing right next to them were just previously singing C naturals. A better realization would put the C natural and C sharp in the same voice part. We should think of these passages sort of like common tones. If the two chords have two versions of the same note, we should realize those notes in the same voice. Johann Georg Albrechtsberger gave these examples of the same basic chord progression using applied dominant sevenths in their different inversions. The first example uses applied root position seventh chords. Notice that the realization of each applied seventh omits the chordal fifth and resolves to the next triad in the standard way, while at the same time avoiding chromatic cross relations with the preceding chord. Rearranging the progression to allow applied 6/5 chords leads to a much harsher sound, since the bass leaps by diminished fourths, and two of the triads must be incomplete in order to avoid cross relations. In my opinion, the chromatic 4/3 version leads to the most fluent realization of this particular chord progression, since all of the chords have complete harmony, and the bass line is able to move in smooth, stepwise motion. Finally, the version using 4/2 chords also produces a strong melodic bass line, but the applied sevenths now alternate with 6/3 position triads, and so this version sounds the least stable. To conclude, here are two final figured bass lines that you can use to practice applied dominant seventh chords and their inversions. Stay tuned for the next video, when we will finish our study of seventh chords by looking at how Albrechtsberger taught Beethoven to incorporate the dominant seventh into his strict counterpoint exercises. Bye for now.